So this morning our talk is going to be about tropical houseplants, especially on a day like today where it really is so very, very cold. It's great to have something warm and sunny and beautiful to think about, right? Escape from this weather a little bit. So a little bit about me. Like I said, my name is Kathleen. I'm one of the horticulturists here on staff at CCE Westchester. I have, in terms of my credentials, I have a bachelor's degree in environmental science from Wellesley College. I have about 7 years, maybe 8 years of ornamental experience in ornamental landscaping, garden center retail, greenhouse maintenance, lots of different things within the field of horticulture. I worked for 3 years very specifically at my college botanic gardens, mostly working with tropical and exotic plants. And then I also, as pictured here, worked at the greenhouses that are actually at Walt Disney World in Orlando, Florida. So very, very, very tropical. Obviously, we're in Florida, but we also, in the greenhouses at Disney, we did really prioritize some of those really interesting, really unique tropical plants. So that's where I'm coming from, my background. Hope you believe that I know my tropicals pretty well. Um, so talking about tropical houseplants. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, these plants here, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about what it means when I'm talking about tropical plants, when I'm talking about house plants. We're going to talk about the care of these plants and troubleshooting, a pretty wide variety of topics. So with our tropical houseplants, so these are some of the popular ones that you'll see in stores, right? There's a spider plant, a pothos, monstera, philodendron, even things like palms and orchids. We don't necessarily think of those as being as tropical as some of these other leafy ones, but they definitely love those tropical areas in the world. So like I said, there's a pretty big variety. I will say, just to start, so if you know anything about houseplants, you might be thinking, wait a minute, pothos, philodendron, monstera, I thought those were maybe some of the same thing, or they sort of shared different plants within the family. So that is a little bit confusing. So there are these families of plants that I have listed. So philodendron, monstera, pothos, Syndapsis, and Epipremnum. If you see those 5 photos there, they're not in order according to the words I wrote above, but it's pretty hard to tell them apart. Even people who own these houseplants might look at these photos and not know exactly which one is called Epipremnum or Monstera, because if you see, they all have extremely similar leaves. Their leaf stems, they tend to attach to the stem the same way. They tend to grow in the same way. They're vining plants. So it can be really confusing for people when they're talking about houseplants because they're like, wait a minute, which one is which? So a great explanation for that, this is which one is really which, in case you were wondering. It's a little bit tricky. An explanation for that actually comes down to the way that we classify plants. So the family Araceae, that's it, the family Araceae. So that actually contains most of the houseplants that we know and talk about on a regular basis. So in this sector, this is called a phylogenetic tree. That's actually how scientists will classify and sort of make a chronological map of the plants that we have on Earth. So has to do with the evolutionary history, but also has to do with how plants are related on a pretty large scale. So this family, Araceae, contains all of these subfamilies, and within that, if you note that bullet point on the side there, it contains Aglaonema, or Chinese evergreen houseplants, Alocasia, which are elephant ears, Anthurium flowers. Those are those bright red, sometimes called a painter palette or an oilcloth flower. Caladium is another kind of elephant ears. Dieffenbachia or dumb cane. Epipremnum is also called pothos a lot of the time. Humulonema, monstera, that sort of Swiss cheese plant. Nephthyitis and Syngonium are arrowhead plants, is what they're usually called. Rhaphidophora is a vine very, very closely related to Monstera. Spathiphyllum is a peace lily, and Zamioculcas is a ZZ plant. So if that was a big long list of plants, but if you think about it, that's a huge portion of the house plants that people really generally keep nowadays, and they all fit into this one family. So in 1876 was the first time that a scientist actually defined these plants and said, this is what they're called, this is how they're related, and it actually was not revised until 2013. So all this to say, if you don't know to call something a philodendron or a pothos or a monstera, because they just look so similar, the chances are it doesn't really matter that much. So the Missouri Botanical Garden, they actually said most debates over rank are close to meaningless. So the exact same title, other than the name of the plant, could be used to justify dozens of additional subfamilies within this Araceae family. So if you're worried about the name of a houseplant, just know that it's a little bit of a loosey-goosey categorization. The important thing is that I always say to people is if you know a scientific name, right? Maybe you call a monstera a philodendron and close enough. That's going to get you a lot more information on the plant than a common name, especially because common names are just not standardized at all. And everyone and their grandma has their own special name for their plant. It's really great to know even just a name, if you look at your Swiss cheese plant and you can come up with monstera, that's going to be a big key to unlocking things. I just say all this about categorization to know that don't worry too much about the little details with houseplants. We didn't do a lot of work on them for a long time, so scientists are still in the process of re-examining what those all mean. They're pretty closely related, is what I'm saying. So some houseplants quickly I'll talk about that I'm not covering today, and I'll explain a little bit why. So I'm not talking about what is commonly called succulents. I'll talk about them a little bit at the end, just sort of the problems with that succulent name. And then I'm not talking about cacti or African violets. For the most part, those three are desert plants. They're not really tropicals. Snake plants and ZZ plants, they absolutely are tropical houseplants and they're very, very popular, but they are such low maintenance plants that I'm not really going to cover them. Just know that they're very hardy. They can accept a lot of light. They're going to be fine. And then I'm not going to be covering ferns or carnivorous plants just because they are very, very unique. They're very much their own thing. Ferns are reproducing from spores. They are extremely old in an evolutionary time frame. And then carnivorous plants, actually, there's a lot of carnivorous plants, including the Sarracenia pitcher plants that come up from the ground and kind of look like a little, I don't know, a little hand puppet almost. And the Venus flytrap, those are actually native to the United States. They are not tropical, which is, I think, not something people expect. We expect them to come from some weird forest in the middle of nowhere, but they're actually from like North Carolina, basically. So I'm not covering any of these plants today. They're very, very interesting, but they'll take a lot more attention and their own special topic. So what I love to do when people come to me about houseplants is I love to think of them in this scale. So yes, we can go and get a peace lily from any store that we want to, florist or a garden center, or even sometimes like Target will have them. But not many people pick up that peace lily and think, if you look on the screen here, that they're coming from South America. That's where they're from originally. It's not something that people really think of all that often. I find this really, really important because I don't live in these tropical forests, but these plants are really expecting a very certain ecosystem, and it really helps to understand where they come from, to understand how to best take care of them. So you see, I took some of those popular houseplants from the beginning, and I put them on a map here to show that they mostly all sit around what are literally called the tropics, right? Those areas around the world that are close to the equator that tend to have very, very lush green rainforest type settings. So it's not surprising to see that they all come from there natively. So like I said, the biology is going to be really helpful for that clue to understanding how to take care of your plant. So somewhere in the world, every plant is native, which means it's growing very specifically along with the plants, insects, micro and macrofauna, so animals, and then just the environmental biome around it. So it's not just that it's warm and humid, it's that there are so many different life cycles occurring in and around that plant that make it thrive. So our living rooms are not ecosystems, as I say here. We can't necessarily perfectly duplicate those environments, but we can try to just give them as much as we possibly can, right? So my favorite example for people is an orchid. So an orchid, a lot of people don't know, is actually an epiphyte. Specifically, the orchids we tend to get at the grocery store or at a florist. That is called a phalaenopsis or moth orchid. I'll talk about it in a few slides. So these are epiphytes. So epi means upon and phyte means plant. So they don't grow in the ground in the soil, they grow upon another plant. They stick to the sides of trees and essentially grow up the sides of trees, and they don't have soil at all. So if you're thinking about a plant that grows like that, they don't have soil, or if they do, it's very little, tiny bits of dirt maybe stuck in a tree or on the bark. It's mostly going to be bark and moss that it's surviving off of. They don't necessarily get very frequent waterings because they're up on the side of a tree. They get whatever runs down. And they do like that high humidity because of those tropical rainforests they live in. So if we're growing that in our house, maybe we use orchid bark as a potting material because that is similar to a tree bark. Maybe we put in a lot of moss. Maybe we just use one of those orchid pots that actually you don't need to put anything in. They stick their roots through the holes in the side. Basically, we're just trying to mimic that tree that it grows on in nature. So, and then we would only water infrequently, maybe once or twice, or once a week or once every 2 weeks. And a good soaking water as opposed to just pouring a little on. We might want to dunk it in water just because it's going to be a little bit more like a big soak of a rainforest, right? And then they love that humidity. If we can do that, that will really help. But understanding the biology can also help in that we know what that plant is, how it reacts to its environment. So my second example there is that a Venus flytrap is a flowering plant, but it only flowers when it's really stressed because it's trying to make some seeds before it dies so that something keeps surviving. So you might look at your plant and say, it's flowering, that's beautiful. But understanding how that Venus flytrap is reacting to its environment and on a biological level helps to understand that that flower maybe means you should do some digging to try and figure out what's going on. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our popular houseplants, kind of talk about some care with them, just give some examples of the plants that we like to see. So I'm starting off with the Monstera. The one pictured here is specifically a Monstera deliciosa. Some people call it the Swiss cheese plant. They're just a very, very common, very nice, and recently very popular houseplant. They're very popular. They're pretty low maintenance. They don't really ever want to be in direct sun, but they love bright and indirect light. They can handle some lower light, but they might not grow as big or broad of leaves. They want to be in a well-drained soil or a bark because they actually are also an epiphyte. They tend to essentially vine up trees in their natural habitats. They do love high humidity, but they can actually dry out okay and survive. They're pretty resistant to drying out. And then because they do vine, they climb, they might need structural support. So if you've had one for a long time, it might be kind of, exploding out of its growing area. So that's something to keep in mind that they can get pretty big. And then I mentioned at the bottom there, Adansonii, which is also a common Monstera. It's smaller, it's more of a not direct, maybe a common looking vine. It's almost kind of a wrinkled look to the leaves. That, as well as pretty much any philodendron that you're growing at home, they're going to have very similar care to a Monstera. They're very, very closely related, pretty much the same approach. Ficus plants, these are really popular, and there's also a lot of ficuses that people like to grow. So I know fiddle leaf fig has become popular in the last few years, as well as rubber trees, but there's all sorts of different figs even pictured here. Some of them can be quite picky. So like a fiddle leaf fig or a Ficus triangularis, Ficus benjamina, they can be really picky. Maybe they don't like the light you put them in, they drop a bunch of leaves. I know the Ficus triangularis doesn't like moving air. If you put it anywhere that it will get a breeze, it will be pretty upset. So some of them can be very picky, but others are very adaptable. Like a rubber tree tends to be very, very flexible. You can kind of beat them up and they'll be okay. Most of them thrive in bright indirect light or partial sun. They can handle sun, but they would prefer more morning light, something a little bit more gentle. And because they are woody plants, they can be pretty resistant to drought, but they do better when they're regularly watered. So that doesn't necessarily mean often, just you stick to the watering schedule. They can be finicky with changes as well. Like I said, whether it's the moving air, you move houses. I mean, I've lost plenty of ficuses over the years moving apartments. So changes in the growing environment can be hard for them. So that's something to keep in mind. So Maranta and Calathea, in this picture, the Maranta is up on the top and the Calathea is down on the bottom. They are often called prayer plants. There's a lot of different varieties on how these look. Some of them can be very, very colorful, beautiful. They're pretty unique looking. And they're actually both very pet friendly. They're really nice and very closely related. They're a nice houseplant. These are low light plants. They do not want to be in sun and they don't even necessarily want super bright light. They really like high humidity and just an even moisture. They do not want to dry out, and if they dry out, they don't bounce back well. Calathea specifically can be very sensitive. I know some people have issues when they give them hard water, they don't thrive. The temperature is wrong. There's too dry of air. They can be pretty picky. So they're beautiful, but they might take some work. And then they both are somewhat susceptible to houseplant pests. So it's important to scout them regularly. If you ever find pests on one of these plants, they actually will respond pretty well to pruning. You can just cut out whatever part of the plant is heavily infested and they should be pretty okay. Within reason, obviously you can't cut a huge amount of the plant off, but there's a little piece coming off of your Maranta that has a mealybug. You could just cut it and throw it away. You should be pretty good to go. Alocasia, also known as the elephant ears. A lot of people use these out in their yard and they're really beautiful out in the yard, but some of them, certain varieties, do so well inside. So the one pictured here is an Alocasia poly. It's a very common houseplant variety. Alocasia, they actually will burn, their leaves will burn in direct sunlight, but they can do a pretty big range of indirect light. They can do bright all the way to a pretty dim, dark room, or LED lights like you'd have up in the install the light bulbs. They do not want to dry out, but they can be susceptible to rot because of their succulent root system. So you want to make sure that they're not going to dry out, but you don't want to overwater. So water when the top 2 inches of soil are dry. Usually what we tell people in the industry is to stick your finger in somewhere between the first and second knuckle. If you pull your finger out, it's completely dry, there's no soil stuck to it, it's time to water. They also love warmth and humidity if they can take it, but they're a little bit more, I guess, flexible with humidity. So Pilea and Peperomia, I group these together. They're not necessarily super closely related, but they have a very similar sort of style. So pictured here right now, these are 2 peperomias. So they are actually a succulent plant, which means that they are very fleshy and very full of water. They have a lot of really cool, unique looks, fun colors, and they're pretty actually hardy. They are not a cactus, that is important to know. So they don't want to dry out as much as a cactus would, but they can handle drying out to some extent. Most of the time people think something that is cactus-like wants full sun, but these ones actually prefer bright indirect light, and they can go all the way to a lower light. And all of this goes for Pilea as well. They do like the humidity because they are tropicals. And then the fun thing about Pilea and Peperomia, this is a Pilea right here and the peperomia. So the fun thing about Pilea and peperomia is that they propagate very, very well. So these are the kinds of plants that people love to share with their friends. You know, little bits come off. The Pilea sends off little babies you can propagate from. So it's a fun one to have around. Palm trees, like I mentioned. So I know sometimes people think of palms as being sort of desert-like, and there are palms that grow in desert-like situations, but actually a lot of our palms are tropical in the world. Um, there's a huge variety of palms. So some want to be in bright direct sun, some want to be in more of a indirect light. They might burn in the sun. And for the most part, a lot of them are drought tolerant, but a lot of them are going to want regular watering and staying fairly damp. Not damp like soaked, but similar to the alocasia that, you don't want it really to dry out for too long. Otherwise, it's just not going to thrive. Palms, they do have a lot of nooks and crannies because of how their leaves grow. So if they get houseplants, it can be hard to get houseplant pests. It can be hard to get rid of them. They might be hiding somewhere you can't see. So it's important that you want to keep them essentially away from stressful conditions as much as possible, and then making sure they stay clean, pulling out dead branches and dead leaves, wiping down leaves when they start to get dusty or dirty. That can really help suppress some of that insect pest population. Coffee trees are really common as well. So they're a really fun, great house plant. They're a tree, so they actually can survive a lot of stress. I said in the bottom here, so they don't always love being indoors because they are a pretty high light tree. And sometimes those plants that require high light, they just don't ever really get enough light in the house. But the thing is because they have a woody stem, might take a little while to adapt, but once they adapt, they can be pretty reliable. So, these coffee plants, they love high humidity and they want good moisture, but they do not want that moisture to stick. They have to have good drainage, otherwise their roots can rot in the soil. So pothos and spider plants, again, these ones aren't necessarily super closely related, but I grouped them together here just because they pretty much they have a lot of the same care requirements. So they can be anywhere from really bright, even direct sunlight, to pretty dim. These are a very popular, just kind of across the board plant. They do really well in a lot of places. They are moderately tolerant to drying out, although for the most part, both of them have the ability to droop a little bit and perk back up. So if you see them drooping, you say, oops, I forgot to water. If you water them, they'll bounce back just fine. Both of them go pretty dormant in the winter. So I know a lot of people sometimes will say, something's wrong with my spider plant or my pothos isn't growing anymore, but they do have a pretty marked period of dormancy. So they will slow down, they'll stop for a little while, but they'll bounce back in the spring. Once it starts to get warmer, the days get longer. These ones also both propagate extremely easily. So pothos, you can take cuttings of the stems, whereas spider plants, if you've seen before, they have all those little babies, which are really fun. So again, another fun one to share with your friends. The peace lily, the spathiphyllum, this is a common one, especially because they are known for being very, very low light, which can be great for people who don't have great light inside their house for houseplants. And then they're also known, actually, NASA released a study that they're one of the best plants for air purification. So a lot of people find them really popular for those reasons. The peace lilies, they really would like a rich potting soil. They want something that is very rich and can give them a lot. They don't want something that's necessarily super fast draining. It's important to give them that rich soil, and they don't want to dry. So if you've ever had a peace lily, when they dry, they wilt very dramatically. They make a big stink that you're not watering them. They do bounce back. If you can, if you see them wilt and you can water within a day or two, they will bounce back, but they might lose a leaf or two. They're dramatic. Peace lilies do have these lovely white flowers, and they can actually bloom at any time of the year. So they're a pretty steady grower once they're happy in the home. And then they are, like I said, they're fairly low light. So you don't ever want to put one of these in the sun. They will not like it. Orchids, like I said, so most houseplant orchids that we're used to are actually the Phalaenopsis orchids. So that's what's pictured here. It's called the moth orchid. Some growers will get more fancy. They'll get an oncidium, cattleya, dendrobium, all sorts of orchids. But typically we have this one right here, which is an epiphyte. So as I mentioned before, you don't want to give it soil. You want to give it something very loose, something that it can just kind of snake its air roots through like a tree. Once a week soaks, like I said, is going to be really great for an orchid. And then actually orchids can tolerate a good range of sun. I think a lot of people think of them as being a fairly dim, low light plant, but they can actually tolerate some sun as long as it's a more gentle, like early morning sun. And then other varieties of orchids actually are full sun plants as well. Dracaena, this is another common one that there's a lot of variety in. They're called a cane plant. So because of that thick skin, that cane they have on their stems, they're very, very drought tolerant. And they like bright, but I think a lot of people tend to put these ones in the sun. Most of them actually will burn if they're in direct sun. So they would prefer bright, but not direct. They can be really sensitive to heat and water quality, actually. These ones can be really sensitive to things like salts, chlorine even that might be in water. So if you ever have that issue, what's best is to fill up, your watering can of tap water and then actually leave it on the counter for maybe an hour. That helps some of the anything that might be in the water start to dissipate and dissolve within the water. It's not as harsh for these guys. And sometimes they do show symptoms of something like heat or poor water quality, very obviously, but they bounce back well. They're very hardy plants. So this is our last one I'm going to talk about in specifics, but citrus trees are very, very, very common as houseplants. And they do actually very well in these small containerized houseplants, environments. Even though they're a fruit tree, we might expect that they wouldn't thrive very much. They do very, very well. So it is crucial with citrus trees that they get good drainage, and you want to give them some time between watering. So again, because they are a woody plant, that woody stem is going to prevent them from losing a lot of water, and they can hold a lot of water in that stem. So deep waterings, leave some time in between. That's what they're going to like best. And then especially if you're trying to grow like some fruit in your home, it's actually very common that they do grow fruit in the home, but it's important you want to give them some fertilizer only during the growing season. You don't want to fertilize in the winter where they're slowing down. And then, yeah, you can produce fruit. You can have some fruit to eat at home, which is great. So all of these lovely houseplants are really well and good, but what can go wrong? So kind of a lot, unfortunately, with houseplants. So first of all, there are limitations of houseplants, right? We can't necessarily control our houses like a greenhouse. We don't have a ton of sun like a greenhouse or even outdoors. There's a lot of things that, we kind of have to keep our houses for ourselves, and it's not great for the plants. So there definitely are limitations. Some of the ones I have listed here is indirect light. We think inside we see this light coming in from the sun and we're like, wow, it's so bright. But objectively, if you were outside on the forest floor and getting indirect light filtered through the leaves, it is way brighter than the light that we see inside. If you actually use a UV meter indoors, it essentially registers that light as basically nothing. So indirect light, most of the time our plants can adapt and they'll do just fine, but certain things we actually need to put more into sun than we normally would outside just because of how dark it can be in our homes. When we don't have those diverse ecosystems, a vibrant soil, all of these different life cycle processes, predatory insects, we lose some of the natural strengths that our plants would have outdoors in an ecosystem. And, not like we want to release ladybugs into our houses to eat the aphids, so we're kind of stuck. A lot of plants, especially something like a vegetable or an herb, people want to grow them inside because maybe we don't have the room, maybe we don't have the outdoor space. But when they say 6 to 8 hours of sun, it's really uncommon that a house or especially like an apartment is going to get 6 to 8 full hours of sun, if not more, for that plant to thrive. Some people are lucky enough to have skylights or conservatories in their houses that they actually can have that, but for the most part, people can't really provide enough sun for those high sun plants. And then we often do temperature control our houses, but we don't necessarily control humidity, or we can't in a very effective way. Or there might not be good circulation. You know, the temperature's okay, but the air doesn't move and these plants get kind of stuck. So, like I said, we have limitations, especially with our environment. An important thing is too, with our houseplants, is to understand our expectations versus the reality. So because they're not growing naturally, tropical plants are probably not going to do what they do best. You know, they're not going to do what they're known for. So growing your tropical houseplants, looking for fruits, flowers, extracted products, it just might not happen when you're in the house. So some of our examples, citrus trees often do fruit indoors, but you might need to pollinate them by hand, depending on if you ever have any bugs in your house or not. And you're more likely to grow something like a Meyer lemon or a key lime in the house as opposed to our commercial crop varieties, just because those two have been found to be more adaptable to those containerized growing. So your expectation might be fresh tart limes to squeeze on my food, and then you're growing a key lime, which just has a very different flavor profile. Some plants grown indoors will never produce enough to consume. So coffee is actually what they grow is called a cherry. It's a small red berry. Inside that cherry are two beans. And to produce 8 ounces of coffee, you have to get about 40 coffee cherries. So you'd have to have your tree long enough that it starts producing flowers. It have to be pollinated to produce the cherries. You'd have to grow 40 cherries, and then you'd have to pick those cherries, take out the beans, dry the beans, roast the beans, you know, grind the beans and make the coffee. So you're not necessarily buying a coffee tree to make coffee at home. And then some tropical plants are just unlikely to ever use or produce a flower, let alone a fruit, just because of the environment. So Monstera, they actually do produce these amazing, about 1 foot to 18-inch white showy flowers that have a delicious, delicious green fruit in the center, but it's extremely rare that a Monstera can flower indoors just because they need a lot more specific environments to do that. Vanilla orchids, very, very unlikely that you'll ever get a flower from a vanilla orchid indoors. And then pollinating a vanilla orchid is a very, very difficult process. I can say that as having done it in real life. You could pollinate 20 vanilla flowers in person and only 2 will actually take. Dragon fruit cacti, again, very unlikely that they'll flower. Their flowers can be 2 feet long. They're very showy, but they take a lot of energy that they probably just aren't getting enough of from a home environment. Banana trees, they will grow very well inside, but it's very unlikely that they will produce any kind of flower or fruit from that tree. And avocado trees, I know people love to save the pit and put it in water, but it's going to be probably 8 to 10 years before that tree could grow anything. And then because it's inside of a house, it probably won't. So like I said here, they all require many years of greenhouse care to produce flowers and fruit, obviously outdoors as well, but they need a lot more specificity of their growing environment to actually get those things. Another thing not listed on here, just in terms of that extracted products or plant parts, some people like to grow things like ginger or turmeric that you eat the roots, but sometimes in a pot, root growing plants, things might rot underground. It's not enough room to really bulk up and grow a good root. So not that you can't do that, but you might not get a viable root that you think you will. And then things that really require processing. Another example I don't have here, like cinnamon. Cinnamon is actually made from the inner bark of a tree. So you have to have a healthy tree, peel the bark back, peel the inner bark back, and then you've killed at least part or all of the tree by taking that inner bark. So it's really not the most reasonable thing to expect as a houseplant owner. So again, it's just understanding that these tropical plants can make some pretty incredible things, but in a house, we're probably not going to get those things. So troubleshooting some of our houseplants. So my favorite thing to do when I have a houseplant struggle is to just consider what might have changed. So things like AC, heat, any kind of fan, even the like fan above the stove in the kitchen, dehumidifier, climatic appliances, really they can change a lot. Even something like a refrigerator can put out its own heat and cooling that can affect nearby plants. So understanding what might have changed, your AC kicked on for the summer. Did you bring a new plant into the house? So new plants are unfortunately pretty likely to come in with some sort of insect or maybe even disease with them. So whether you're looking at the plant that has the problem and it's new, or there's an old plant next to a new plant that's struggling, considering things like UV warnings or air quality warnings. We've had a couple days here because of wildfires where our air quality is really bad. That affects plants too. And UV warnings means that they might be burned by sun that normally doesn't bother them. So, understanding what's going on outside, leaving a window open could be so many things, right? It could be a bug, honestly, even could be an animal in some cases, could be the wind, it could be so many things. And then rearranging furniture or moving. Like I said, plants don't always love that physical change. They want to stay in their spot. So what you can do when you're troubleshooting, you can scout, so using a magnifying glass or even phone cameras to look for insects on and under leaves. Checking your soil for things like poor drainage, root rot, or fungus gnats. Those are those little tiny gnats that fly around your plants. They tend to lay their eggs in the soil. And then it's always important to try and find a source of your symptoms before trying a solution. So if you're trying to figure out what's causing these leaves to look so dead on the ends, and then you find out that it was your cat chewing on them, you don't want to be spraying a pesticide because you think it's a bug. You want to make sure you understand what's happening first. If you don't know how to find the source, call us at CCE. You can send photos to our email. You can call us. You can even bring in a sample of a plant. We're happy to help. I would say houseplants are probably one of the things we're asked about least, and it's really fun to talk to them. So, or talk about them. We don't talk to them usually. Depends on the day. And then just lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about what to consider before buying a houseplant because it's really important to keep these things in mind. So when it comes to maintenance, you want to understand what you can do, what your environment is like, understanding what really can be done. So some plants are marketed as easy, but most of the time it comes down to the environment you can provide rather than your ability to grow a plant. So people will buy easy plants and they die, and then they're like, oh, I'm terrible at plants. It's probably really not your fault. So cheaper bargain plants at stores that maybe don't sell plants primarily might already have insect or disease problems. They're probably not as well taken care of, or they're just under high stress and it's hard to acclimate them. Just because a plant is a desert plant does not mean it's an easy plant. In some cases, it might mean less maintenance because maybe you're watering less or you don't have to fertilize, but it doesn't mean that they're just easy. Picking plants whose natural environments can match either your home or your maintenance ability. So if you don't have a lot of time to water your plants, maybe pick something that you don't need to water as often, or something like an orchid that doesn't need a lot of soil maintenance. Maybe that's a best fit for you because you don't have to worry about the growth media. It's growing its air roots. You can leave it be. Personally, this one's from me. I prefer what I like to call flaggers. So I like things that show me when they need something. So even a peace lily, like I said, they're very dramatic, but peace lilies, dracaenas, even some, and pothos, they wilt and they perk back up. If you water them, they will perk back up. But sometimes it's nice if you forget, if you're busy, you see them wilt, you say, oh yeah, I can water them. And they're not going to punish you for it if you forget. Succulent plants and cacti, a lot of those tend to get kind of wrinkly, kind of like pruny when they're not watered enough. Aloe vera plants, they actually change colors when they're not watered. They might turn a kind of a purple or a gray, or even like a light brown. They're not dead or crunchy, but they change colors. So that can be a reminder. And then rubber trees, sometimes they start to drop leaves, but then as soon as you water them, they grow more. So, so I like those because when I'm busy and I forget, sometimes it's nice for them to remind me. And then I did promise I was going to talk a little bit about succulents. I just wanted to talk about them because they're kind of a myth. So what we generally call succulents, that is not a scientific class of plants. That is not a taxonomic type of plants. So cacti are, if you're looking at, plant families in a textbook, cacti is a type of plant. Succulent is not. Succulent as a word is just an adjective, and it refers to something that is usually thickened, fleshy, and full of water or sap. It's not a scientific classification. So begonias are succulents. Aucuba shrubs are succulents. Even a lot of holly shrubs are succulents. Really anything that has those thick, fleshy stems that hold a lot of water, they are succulent plants. So I bring this up because a lot of times people say, oh, well, succulents, but succulents refers to a huge variety of types of plants that grow in a huge variety of places. So it's really hard to give people advice on succulents when they're not the same whatsoever. So they're not necessarily the easiest plant, which, like I said, and why aren't they the fail-safe plant? It's because of light and because of water. Like I said, because they are so different from each other, some of them need different light and some of them need more or less water. But for the most part, high light and direct sun, they mean really, really high light. So putting something on a windowsill where it gets 4 hours of sun, not enough for most of them. They want 6 hours minimum, if not 8 or more. And when they say low water, they mean really, really low. Succulents rot really easily because of how much water they store in their leaves. And in soil that doesn't drain well, it's so fast that they can come up with rot. Even when you get something like Cactulus and succulent potting mix from the store, it's not even enough drainage. So a lot of those tend to be still a pretty heavy potting soil with just a little bit of sand or some sort of blanking on the word right now, other materials mixed in, right? But most succulent plants actually thrive in 50% non-soil or more. So, gravel, all sorts of different things. They don't want that heavy soil because that holds a lot of water on that root. So again, when it comes to these different types of succulents, the native source is key. So a lot of the traditional sort of succulents, people like those that have that sort of radial symmetry look. So something like Echeveria and Sempervivum. Here's a picture right here of some hens and chicks. So these two families of plants, they actually tend to grow on rocks or in rocky mountain areas. So very low humidity, essentially no root and anywhere, right? There's not deep roots that can go into these rocks, and they get pretty extreme sun. So beating down on them all day, pretty intense. Again, hard to make that happen in a pot in your house. Euphorbia and aloe, so there's an aloe right there. Euphorbia and aloe, they tend to have very thick skin and spines like cacti. So because of that thick skin layer, that dermal layer, they're a bit more adapted to desert conditions, even if they're not all desert plants. Kalanchoe, so this is an example of Kalanchoe. There's a lot of different Kalanchoes. They're actually Madagascan rainforest plants. They are not desert plants. So if they dry out, they will die. Jade, oh, I cut off a little bit on the bottom there. So jades, there's a jade right there, the Crassula family. The family Azoaceae. So if you've ever had something like a lithops, there's one called baby toes. There's all of these ones that they kind of look shiny and smooth like a rock. They are very, very specific, but there's a huge family of them. Haworthia, which is one of these right here, and then Senecio. So if you've ever had those trailing, there's like the chain of dolphins and hearts and turtles and things that they trail over the side. Pretty much all of those plants that I just listed are actually native and or endemic, meaning only found in South Africa. So South Africa has extremely intense desert conditions in most of the country. Not to say that it's just completely barren, they have plenty of lush greenery also, but it's a very, very dry and pretty harsh climate. So a lot of those that I just listed, they tend to have a very thick skin as well, and they are pretty extreme in their water. So lithops, like I mentioned, the living stone, it's recommended to water them twice a year. So these are very, very extreme desert plants. So all of this to say, when people say, get an easy plant, get a succulent, there's a huge definition of what that might mean. And it matters more to the type of plant you get, how to take care of it, than it does just succulent. Not to say you can't grow any of these, you absolutely can, but it's just important to keep in mind that they're not some fail safe that everyone says. Another thing to keep in mind when you're getting a plant, obviously, is pet safe if you have pets, and human safe. So we don't regularly interact with these tropicals when we go out the door. So it's important that we know what's going on with them. So this is a great list. The link on the screen for the ASPCA has an animal poison control list of toxic and non-toxic plants. Very, very thorough, and it's actually for cats, dogs, and horses. So they have a huge list there. And then for people, so number one, we have to think about spines, spikes, and irritants, right? So citrus trees have big thorns on them. A lot of cacti and succulents have things called glaucids, which are actually hook-shaped, minuscule little spines that you can't really see them most of the time, and then they hook into your skin. Not comfortable. A lot of tropical plants actually have histamines in their leaf hairs, which means when that brushes on your skin, it makes you itchy or break out in hives. Some people have high reactions to them. And then things that might have fibers, or even like something like a sugar cane has little tiny pieces of this like sugar on them. Those can actually cut your skin. So it's important to be aware of what is really sharp and might actually hurt you. Number two, we have saps. So saps can be staining, burning, or actually react in the sun. You can get sunburns from sap. So sap could be in or on plant tissue. Sap is not necessarily just goo. I mean, some sap has latex in it. Aloe vera actually has a special latex called aloin in its plant sap. And when it's freshly broken, it can actually be stronger than normal and irritate some people's skin if they're sensitive, or irritate, your stomach if you're eating it. So it's actually best when you break an aloe plant, if you're looking to use that sap or eat the plant, give it some time. Let the aloin naturally run out or just oxidate. So it reduces its risk as it goes on. And then, like I said, the sunburn is called phytodermatitis, phytophotodermatitis, where it essentially magnifies the strength of the sun on your skin where the sap hits, and then you can get sunburns. So it's pretty bad. Some lime trees are actually known for that, fig trees as well. So it's important to keep in mind. And number three, allergies. So allergies are important because, again, we don't interact with these plants. So maybe the fruit or the leaves or the stem, the pollen even, just really could be reactive to people. Cashews, mangoes, and sumac are actually closely related to poison ivy. So all parts of those plants can be really dangerous to people. Again, we don't interact with them on a regular basis, so we maybe don't know that as much as somebody who lives in these tropical places. And then sourcing, I'll burn through these pretty quickly, but basically it's really hard to get a trusty plant from the internet. So it can be really risky. Sometimes ordering seeds online, you're not going to get the right thing you ordered, or you might get something that is not clean, is not safe to use. And if you want to be buying a plant, you should always be ordering plants or seeds from a trustworthy seller. So unfortunately, Amazon, some of these other third-party sellers, they are not trustworthy. They don't always require, when they're using a third-party seller, any sort of documentation. So as I listed here, New York State Ag and Markets, plant sellers have to be registered in the state. They also have to be able to provide an inspection certification so that we are not sending plants that have dangerous pests or invasive issues coming along with them. And then sometimes even some people ship seeds with pesticide treatments on them that are illegal in our state, right? So it's hard to get something through a third-party seller that we can guarantee will be safe to use. There's a lot of really really great plant sellers and seed sellers in the world. It's best to go to their websites that you can see all of their certifications, their facilities, why they're supplying plants like that, as opposed to somebody who's on Etsy or Amazon. Again, there's some permitting too, if you're importing internationally, although avoid that if possible. Pretty much any plant at this point can be sourced from within the country just because of how we grow plants nowadays. Shopping local is also great, especially to prevent things like invasive species. Shipping around the country is a sure way to spread things that we don't want to spread. And so it's, with tropical plants, it's hard. Maybe a lot of those are coming up from Florida because we just don't have the environment for it. But if possible, depending on what you're getting, if you can get something that comes from nearby, that's a great bet. It's not a glamorous topic, right? Permitting, certifications, but it's really important that you pay attention to these things while you are looking into taking care of plants, right? Because you don't want to be spreading something. You also don't want to be bringing anything nasty into your house. That's the thing with houseplants, is that they're in your home. So if you come in with a really nasty bug hiding on a leaf, it's in your house now. So it's just a really great way. You want to make sure you're conscious of what you're getting. So now we have some questions. I guess I am able to see them with my screen shared. I wasn't sure if I would. So there's a comment here. What's a good way to provide humidity to an orchid in the winter when our homes are so dry? That's a great question. So fortunately, orchids actually are pretty flexible with humidity levels. When it is very, very dry, though, you definitely don't want to leave any water in the pot. I know some people will overwater a plant and because they say, well, extra water helps the humidity. What's actually been best for indoor plants that people recommend is a tray of gravel and water. If you have a pot that has some sort of catch built into it and you can put that on top of the water, that's fine. Otherwise, you can put it next to the plants because you don't want any roots to be sitting in that standing water. But leaving that little tray out, especially with the gravel in it, will help, raise the local humidity. And especially if you're putting it right next to the plant, as that water evaporates, it will help those plants be a little bit more humid. It has been found, I will say, that misting is not effective. So I know a lot of people do that. We have a question. Do you recommend putting houseplants outside in the summer, and how do you clean them before bringing back inside? Great question. That's really up to you. For the most part, a lot of those tropicals are going to do just fine outdoors in the summer. The ones I would avoid putting outside in the summer is something like a calathea, even maybe a peace lily, a ficus, some of the ones that are more picky when it comes to things like wind or rain, just because they might not like being outside where it's so harsh, especially if they're adapted to your inside environment. But pretty much anything you can absolutely put inside or put outside if you want to. For cleaning them to come back inside, actually one of the best ways to do it is to give them a little shower if you can, put them in the sink, put them in the bath, rinse them down, and then keep them quarantined there for 3 to 5 days if possible. Obviously, maybe you can't leave your your bathtub full of plants for a week, but keeping them away from your other plants is going to make sure that they're not coming straight in to spread something. If you do find a bug, feel free to use something that is safe and approved for homeowner, indoor home use. So maybe a pesticidal product. It is important to remember though that you should not be experimenting. Home remedies are illegal as pesticides in the state of New York. So if in your brain it makes sense to bring it inside and wash it with soap and water, because that's what you do with your hands, just remember that soaps that are not intended for use on plants can be really harsh and actually injure or damage their surfaces and are not intended to kill pests. So a rinse of water is really great, and then keeping it quarantined so that if something is on it, it could die or it's not going to spread. We had another one of recommending putting plants outside. Like I said, it's up to you. If it's a more sensitive plant, maybe not, or if you can put it somewhere outside that it's protected from harsh elements. Otherwise, something like a pothos vine, a monstera plant, I'd love it outside. Why not? And then I have a question here. Water in general, water from top or underneath? Actually, it depends on the plant. So something like an African violet, I know I didn't talk about those today. They actually their leaves suffer a lot of damage if they get water on them. So they want to be exclusively watered from the bottom. And then most plants are actually really good at bottom watering, especially if you're traveling. It's a great way that you can leave your plants. They still will water themselves and you don't have to worry about their water levels if you're gone. Um, I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong answer. Um, certain plants, like I said, they don't want water on their leaves, or some things like ferns sometimes can rot if water gets to the wrong place on their, above ground stuff. But for the most part, watering from the top is just fine. In general, though, you always want to make sure you're watering directly at the soil. You're not pouring over the plant. It's going to make sure you're going to get the most water into your soil and not damage anything along the way. So you won't have any wet leaves. You won't have any perfect spots for bugs to multiply. Just put that watering can straight down to the soil and you should be good to go.